Welcome everyone, Costin here with my faction tier list for Total War Pharaoh Dynasties, ranking all 14 of the major factions. That's actually quite a decent number of playable factions, and that's just the major ones, not the minor ones that are also available, though I'm not going to consider those because obviously they would all be F tier compared to the major factions, just because the major factions have more mechanics, more units, or better units, and structures as well. So let's start with the Aegean, with the Trojans and the Greeks over here, the two principal factions. We have Agamemnon and Priam. I think Agamemnon is a solid A tier. Certainly a lot better than he was in Troy, because in Troy he was really not worth playing. The uniqueness of his campaign is that you could vassalize other factions, which was a whatever mechanic, and his unit roster just didn't work very well. However, now, you do start with Helen, you do start with Menelaus, you do start with Sparta, you do start with Mycenae, and the unit roster in itself has been much improved compared to where it was before. And between that, the changes to the terrain in Greece, which actually did improve the map, even though things have been shrunk, it actually is to the benefit of the Greeks, because there's less island hopping or annoying sieges or annoying minor factions to deal with, which does benefit Agamemnon in a significant way. The sole reason he's not in S tier is due to the fact that he doesn't really start as king, so he doesn't have the same kind of benefits that, say, Priam has. So Priam and Troy, they're getting the S tier rank. Really powerful unit roster of ranged infantry, be it in terms of damage dealing infantry or durability in terms of their infantry. You get Hector, Aeneas, Paris, and of course Priam himself, though it's kind of weird to have Priam on the battlefield. You have a very strong starting position, you have a good amount of diplomatic power, and you do start as king, with all of the benefits that come with that. Because you will have more unit recruitment, you'll be able to get various benefits from factions, you'll be able to give your allies court positions, and you can avoid the civil war completely for the Wanax of the Aegean. And that is really the benefit over there in Priam. Don't get me wrong, Agamemnon's certainly giving him a run for his money, but in effect, it's just that court power that Priam starts with that Agamemnon does not have. Moving on to Egypt, and oh boy, people are not necessarily going to like what I have to say about Egypt. In terms of Ramesses, to be quite blunt about it, Ramesses is a D tier. Not quite an F tier faction, but certainly a D tier faction. There's a couple of problems with Ramesses. He's supposed to be this really friendly faction for new players, or at least that was how he was designed in the baseline version of Pharaoh, but he just doesn't work for a couple of reasons. First off, his unit roster. Let's consider the mid-J, those elite expensive units. Well, they're not the best in the world. Light units in general in Pharaoh and in Troy don't do as well as heavy units. Now, this has been improved with lethality, but from my experience at the very least, it is the heavier units that do end up doing better. Another problem, and actually the principal reason why Ramesses is lower on this list compared to other factions, is his starting position. So, on one hand, you want to go into Egypt to obviously gain the legitimacy, the sacred lands, to gain the power of the crown, and so on and so forth. You don't have to do it quite as much now because of the changes that they've done for legitimacy. So, to be clear, if this was the initial version of Pharaoh, Ramesses would be F tier. But improvements in lethality and improvements in legitimacy have improved his situation. However, despite that, you do still have this awkward situation where a civil war breaks out, and you're going to want to go west for a civil war, but at the same time, you do have the Canaanites to the east, you have sea peoples as well to the north and east. You have a lot of problems to your east that are going to be part of your attention, but at the same time, your campaign objectives. So this is a really awkward campaign from this perspective, because you have two conflicting objectives at the same time, and this is a problem. Now, don't get me wrong, having variety in a campaign can work really well, but it's not really variety in Ramesses' campaign. It's one thing to have variety of choices of what you can do in a campaign. Agamemnon and Priam do absolutely have that, for instance. But the problem for Ramesses is you don't. You want the fucking throne of Egypt. So you're going to want to go for Egypt. You're going to want to capture the capital. You're going to want to win that civil war, but then you're going to be attacked by the Canaanites. Some would say, oh, it's just a hard campaign. No, it's a really badly built campaign. You're going to have a hard campaign, but when you have two things that are going in different directions, it's not really great. Then we go into Seti. Oof, Seti is F tier by far, easily. Horrible unit roster, be it native unit-wise. At least Ramesses has some native units to work with him. And unique faction unit-wise. As I said, light units don't do as well as heavy units. But here's the thing, Ramesses at least has elite light units. It does not. And the lower Egyptian part, which weirdly enough in real life represents the northern part. Lower Egypt means where the Nile ends. Upper Egypt is closer to the source of the Nile. That's I think that's the representation. Or it's the height adjustment. One of those things. It's confusing as all hell. Don't get me started. Bronze Age history there's a reason I didn't bother studying it, suffice to say. Anyway, his unit roster is freaking horrible. His unique buildings, his commands, not great either. His starting position is technically okay, smack dab in the middle, being able to choose your targets. See, this is one of the things. He actually does have variety in his campaign, but you're so let down by the lack of good units, lack of good buildings, that you're not going to have a great time with this particular campaign. Then we have Tosret. I'm going to put Tosret as C tier. I think she is better than Ramesses. She's better than Seti by far. Like, if you want to... So Tosret, it's interesting. She has a range focus and kind of chariot focus, but really what Tosret excels at is economy. She gets a bunch of unique buildings that really substantially improve her economic prowess. And because of her starting position close to the desert, where there's a lot of gold, stone, bronze, she can really become an economic powerhouse in quite a few ways. Her archers, interestingly, the upper Egyptian units, the native units that she has, as well as the unique faction units, are pretty decent, certainly much better than Seti in a lot of ways. And while she doesn't have the best archers in the game, she does have a level of durability to her archers that other factions don't have. They can be decent melee, they can survive quite a few hits, so not the most amount of killing power, but certainly a good amount of durability in that respect. Then we have Amenmess. It's an interesting question, where to put Amenmess? I don't want it to feel like, oh, I'm just putting the Egyptian one after another. I think, like, to some extent, there's some arguments to be made in favor of Amenmess being an A-tier faction, but there's also a downside. So, on one hand, let's consider this factor. Amenmess has flat out some of the best archers in the game. And you can talk about, like, Crete, you can talk about the Trojan princes and all that, sure. But, like, the sheer number of archers, the variety of them, and pretty decent spearmen, so he has good line holders, good damage dealers from range, and he does benefit from that improvement in lethality with his archer units. Game changer in that situation. Furthermore, he may very well have the best economy from a practical standpoint, at least early on. Tosret may surpass him later on, but when you look at Amenmess, the gold benefits, the starting location, the safety of that starting location, it is a significant benefit when you combine all of those things together. The downside and the sole reason that I'm not putting it here, because there's many good things that Amenmess does have in terms of faction effects, buildings, economy, range units. The one thing he does lack is melee killing power. He has melee durability, but not killing power. So he doesn't have medium or heavy infantry, or even light infantry that can really do a good amount of damage. He does have good spearmen, or pretty decent spearmen, and a safe starting position, but you are certainly going to feel the lack of that heavy melee killing power in the game, even if you customize your campaign to increase the ammo of missile units. So just bear in mind. Shupal Yuma. Now, this is supposed to be a hard campaign, but I'm going to be blunt about it. Hati is a powerhouse. First off, like Prime, you start as a king, which is a fairly significant benefit. Oh, it should be pointed out, you do start with court position with Amenmess. You also start one with Agamemnon. But Shupal Yuma, he starts as king. On top of that, he has flat out the best heavy infantry in the game. Gray Axemen, they have a good amount of lethality, huge level of durability, and while you can argue Hati is in a vulnerable position from a practical standpoint, sea peoples can be a bit annoying to be sure, but again, you can avoid the Civil War like you can with Priam, you can avoid the Civil War, you can dominate on land, you can have a good amount of military power. You will lack the economy of someone like Ammon-Mes or Priam, or even Agamemnon to some extent, but that unit roster is really going to carry you in a significant number of ways throughout the course of your campaign. So, they were trying to sell this idea like, oh, play defensively. No, play extremely aggressively as Hati. Because again, you have the army fly out some of the best native units and unique units in this particular campaign. And starting as king is a pretty damn good deal. Which brings me to Corinta. I think Corinta is going to be a C-tier faction. So, you could technically argue, well, Corinta has a good amount of heavy infantry as well. Yes, but the problem is they don't have the same kind of power on the battlefield that Shupaluma has. His infantry is more like sword infantry or charging infantry, two-handed infantry, which it's not quite on the same level, suffice to say. I've played quite a bit of hours above their rosters. I can flat out tell you Shupaluma is much better. And on top of that, you don't start as king. You don't start to the same level of power that Shupaluma has. Keep in mind, I'm talking here like legendary difficulty experience because I've played both customized and vanilla campaigns. And with Corinta, you do start with more limited territory. It is a slower paced campaign, and the payoff of making it work is not quite the same. Shupaluma might start in a harder position in some ways, but you do start with a lot more and have the higher potential in the long term. Ursu. Good old Ursu. Where should I put him? I think A tier, really. Let me explain it here. Ursu has the potential of playing a campaign either where he's selling territory or he's really burning everything to the ground. You prosper in both civilization collapse or prosperity dependent on what you decide to do in this particular campaign. On top of that, while your unit roster is not quite the same on Shupaluma, in practice at the very least, because your units may not necessarily be controlled, you do have some really powerful units available in your roster. You have a fairly safe starting position as well, and a great deal of variety in this campaign. See, this is the thing. As Ramesses, you want the Egyptian throne, obvious. If you're playing Ursu, you can go for the throne of Hatti, you can go for the throne of Egypt, you can go for the throne of Mesopotamia. All of those are available in this campaign. You're close enough to all of those locations that you can make it work. It might be a slower start. You do start limited territory, limited army, recruitment, etc. But geez, the way to describe Ursu, I think, is kind of like, and I know this comparison may sound ridiculous, he's kind of like the Grimgor of Pharaoh, or as close to Grimgor as you're going to get in Pharaoh. So burn everything to the ground, rebuild it, and gain a significant level of power. Good unit roster, good mechanics, good position. Then you have Bay. I'm going to put Bay in F tier. Whatever benefits the Canaanite Knights have under Ursu, they lose all of those under Bay. It's just this weird situation. Like, Ursu has the killing power and the heavy infantry power, even if he doesn't have quite defined control. With Bay, they were kind of trying, I think, to make it like the Odysseus campaign in terms of like, these stealthier unit types. It just doesn't work. You start with minor settlements, you have two factions that you have to fight, one because one of them controls the city. You're not at war with them, but it's just a really awkward starting situation to have to deal with Bay in your campaign. And even then, once you overcome it, yes, you can do research instantly, but I'll be honest, being able to do that instantly can be beneficial, undeniably so, but at the same time, the unit roster is not great. You can say, well, you gain a lot of food and wood, but it's not food and wood that you're going to be lacking for. By the way, pointedly, Ursu can actually achieve a much better economy than Bay. Bay is certainly worth allying, but he's not really worth playing as, from my perspective. Yolosapien. Where would I put the D tier? The sea peoples are kind of in an awkward place. I feel they were trying to make this whole situation where you could either choose to be a settled faction or you could just play as the nomadic tribal aspect, but they kind of screwed up. The unit roster that you have isn't necessarily the best of the sea peoples that you have available. Aeolus has a better unit roster. Your starting position is very dangerous as well, because you start sandwiched between everyone. Irsu, Bay, Ramesses, all of which have reasons to dislike you. And even the minor factions you start a war with can really give you a run for your money. So it is a pretty brutal start of a campaign, and the unit rosters and buildings that you get long term are not so great. The mechanics of the sea people do work better than that, but I just don't think that for this particular faction it ends up working quite as well as it could have been. Then you have Aeolus. I'm going to put him in B tier. It just kind of ended up being that way. So it may be, it is an interesting aspect, because he has kind of the same problems as Kurunta, but here's the thing, Kurunta does want to go for the front, Hati. You have a pretty solid unit roster, not quite as great as Shupaluma, nowhere near as great as Shupaluma, but you do have the benefits of the Sea People's mechanics if you want to play with that. You do have a relatively decent starting position, and you don't have to get involved in a civil war or trigger a civil war, because here's the thing, when you're playing Aeolus, Kurunta is going to trigger a civil war in Hati. Whereas if you're playing Kurunta, you're either triggering that civil war yourself or not. So Aeolus can really sneakily benefit from that particular perspective. In some ways, Kurunta is better, but it's just like the way the campaign is forcing you to play, as opposed to Aeolus, who does have that kind of flexibility in his campaign that Kurunta simply lacks in a lot of ways. Can be a bit of a brutal start, but nowhere near as brutal as the other Sea People's faction. Assyria, S-tier, flat out, can be an exceptionally brutal campaign. Don't get me wrong, some people have reported that. You do start with a limited thing, but you have cavalry. You have range cavalry. You have a powerful unit roster, powerful abilities, good ambitions, good location. You don't start with the court position in Mesopotamia, but the sheer power you have in terms of recruitment, units, is there. So Assyria, you can end up really dominating if you're playing over them. Then you have Babylon. I think Babylon is just going to be a solid A tier. Not quite as ridiculous as Assyria can be, but certainly very strong in their own right. You do start with the core position. It's not necessarily the best one because it has special slingers and don't exactly excite me as much. But all the same, you do start with a powerful city that's in a safe location. You do have a fairly safe location at the start. The difference, I would say, between Assyria and Babylon is the fact that Babylon is a safer playstyle to get used to the area and the factions there, whereas Assyria, if you know what you're doing and you're playing well, has a much bigger payoff at the end of the day. So this is my tier list of factions. Would I change anything over here? No, I think I'm fairly fine with all of this. Maybe drop Ramesses to even F tier. There's a pretty strong argument to be made in favor of that particular thing. I would also put Babylon as the highest A tier, or I don't know, just roughly the same over there. So yeah, these are the factions of Total War Pharaoh Dynasties. The way I would describe all of this is the factions that are above, that are either at C tier or above, are worth playing. They're fine to a degree or another. Some are just better than others. D and F, not worth playing. Don't bother with those campaigns unless you just want a whole bunch of pain and suffering. This was not, by the way, about just pure strength, by the way. It's just how well designed these campaigns are in terms of titles, commands, units, buildings, etc. Are you going to feel frustrated playing these campaigns, or is it going to be a good experience for you? Even if you do have some challenges, you certainly will have some of them as Assyria. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more. And let me know what you guys think about all of this.